Hello and welcome to SATB 264. Now, months earlier this year, 2023, writer Glenn Greenberg and I did a discussion on George and his relations with Paul. In this episode, we're doing a similar examination of the interactions between George and John, which are just about as fascinating in their own way as the ones with Paul. And there'll be a bit of overlap as well. But Glenn, as you may know, has done a series of bookazine projects, one on Lennon at 80, then one on Paul at 80. There's the newly published White Album making of bookazine on the newsstands now. In fact, if you look at the website, I will post a link direct to it if you want to check it out. But he has been on the show before. We did a show on Brian Wilson. There was another one we did on a post-1970 Beatles album, what that would look like. But he knows this stuff. And to the extent that any lay person not trained in psychology can do sort of a dive into the history of the dealings between these two Beatles, it's fascinating stuff. And trying to rely on things we know to be true and come up with interpretations for them is basically our goal here. We don't want to project too much out that we don't know what we're talking about. We just want to rely on what we do know about and draw conclusions from that, such as we do here on SATB from time to time. So short of getting an actual trained psychologist on the show, I think this conversation will have to do based on what we know and what we can draw from it. Without wasting any further time, here's Glenn.
Currently, Beatle news-wise,
the new track.
yes, the new track, the AI new track. Yep. And sort of pertinent to our conversation today, John and George, this was the one that they didn't finish in the 90s because George decided it was crap.
Right. Yep.
And that's it now and then. And whether his criticism was of the content of the song itself or
the quality of the sound.
What they were doing with it. Yeah, not getting a handle on it. Hard to say. I don't know if he ever clarified that.
Right.
But it is interesting that he was not afraid to shoot down something that potentially could have been a great thing for all of them. Mm-hmm. You know, to put out that third new Treadle song. What's your take on it? You've probably heard the Lennon demo by this time, and what do you think of the song?
It's this mournful kind of song. It's certainly not an upbeat pop kind of thing.
Yeah, not a real love.
Yeah, it's not a real love. It's not even. There wouldn't have been a chance for them to even Free as a Bird it, you know?
Right.
Jazz it up a little bit. I was not overly impressed with the song. I've always been curious to know what the Threedles would have done with it. Mm-hmm. Just out of pure curiosity, nothing else. I did not think it was going to be something that would stay in my head the way the other two have. I mean, Real Love and Free as a Bird have stayed in my head since they came out.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I would say
there's an emotional connection to him, right?
Oh, well,
I'm sure for you,
absolutely.
Being at Best Buy at midnight.
I mean, I would even say that Real Love probably is in my head more these days and maybe means a little bit more to me now than Free as a Bird did. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if this song, Now and Then, I don't know if it would have entered my consciousness the way the other two did.
Yeah.
Obviously, there is a reason why George shot it down. Mm-hmm. There's also a reason why Paul wants it out. So I'd be very curious to know with which Beatle do I side with when it finally comes out. Will I be saying, yeah, George was right? Or will I be saying, yeah, Paul, Paul has an ear,
Uh-huh. Yeah. It makes me think of, in a similar context, the shooting down of Carnival of Light, which also came from George. And again, Paul is like, oh, I want to get it out there. And there's not a Beatle fan on the planet that would say no to hearing that track, right?
Right. At least once.
At least once, right. We need to hear it again. And I was very disappointed it wasn't the Pepper Deluxe set, because if that's not a home for it, then what is? The fact that George wielded that kind of veto power, I thought was interesting unto itself. But even before the advent of Peter Jackson and AI, Paul was making noise about, yeah, I want to get that out someday. Mm-hmm. And it would have been analog, just for lack of a better term, not the way it was announced a month ago or so when he said, with AI, I'm going to be doing this. And I know for me personally, as well as other people, as soon as you use that coded term, alongside Beatles and it's coming from a Beatle, all the red flags go up. And then you had that clarification from Sean. No. We're not going to be faking a vocal here.
I was bombarded the day and the couple of days after Paul made that announcement. I was bombarded from friends or people who read my bookazines and all that. What do you think? What does this mean? I was like, calm down. And I had to explain to them the whole history that this was the song that was supposed to be on Anthology 3. Mm-hmm. They're not creating an artificial John Lennon vocal. Yeah, they're not doing it. I said all they're using is the technology that Peter Jackson used on Get Back, bringing out the vocals. And I said, and if they're really smart, they can do new versions of Real Love and Free as a Bird so that John doesn't sound like a ghost recording from the other room. They can really single out his voice and really strengthen it and make those tracks sound even better. I said, that's all that means. So stop panicking, calm down. We were supposed to get this 30 years ago. It's just, we're getting it now. That's it. With new technology that'll make it sound better. That's all it is.
And I think if not for the fact that people have been creating these outfakes with it, like right out of the gate. I think the very first one that I heard was the Brian Wilson singing Be My Baby.
Right.
And so you immediately envision, oh my God, how many Beatle solo songs are they going to recast as Beatle performances? Right. Or you see ridiculousness like Beatles singing Bohemian Rhapsody, and they're all awful. Right. It's like, very few of them really are remotely convincing. They're mostly just kind of novelty junk. And you don't want to see that stuff glutting the Beatle airwaves, as it were.
Right. The first one that I heard was somebody taking Paul McCartney's song New and having John do the choruses. Have you heard that one?
I have, yeah.
Okay. I was like, okay, I mean, that's interesting, but...
Yeah, right. It's interesting.
This is not something I'm going to be seeking out.
Yeah, and I was worried about the prospect of fake stuff like newly discovered Beatles live at the Cavern, that kind of stuff happening.
Right.
It's like, oh, great. But I was happy to see the official clarification. And I think Ringo said as much too, like more recently.
He did.
So it'll be something interesting at the very least and see what they do with it. Personally, one of the first thoughts I had, and I know there's going to be a million McCartney fans out there that want to kill me right now, is if he could de-age his voice for things going forward. How amazing would that be?
Yeah. Well, hopefully he recorded all his vocals back then.
Yeah. Right.
that was my second thought when I first heard it. I said, hopefully Paul recorded his all of his vocals back in the 90s, and we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, all his vocals he'll ever need for the rest of his life. What was it? The Irishman? Was that the Scorsese film that they tried to de-age the actors?
Yes. Yeah. They de-aged De Niro and I think Pesci.
Yeah. And, I guess no comment on that.
At this point, my enthusiasm and love for the Beatles has not diminished, but I'm thinking about just in terms of the world at large, and we've just become so much more cynical people. I just have a vision of this coming out and getting the same kind of reception that the new Indiana Jones movie is getting. It's just like, okay, who cares? It's over. The time is done. We've moved on. It would be sad to see that happen, but I kind of think it's in danger of that happening. It's just, I just don't know if there's, we'll see.
Mm-hmm. So I've been trying to think of a line of attack for this conversation, focusing on John and George's relationship, drifting back to the earliest years of the Beatles. And you have the stories of John's initial resistance to bringing George in the first place because he just seemed way too young, way too immature. He was too physically small. Right. But he did win John over with the fact that A, he had talent that they could use, and B, his persona, that he was hip, he was anti-establishment, which dovetailed nicely with John, and he gave as good as he got, which was something that John immediately respected people for. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, one of the first released Beatle originals, part of the Burt Kaempfert stuff, is a Lennon-Harrison composition, of course, Cry for a Shadow. So that flexibility for those two to have a co-write and have it go out as product under their names, more or less, that's an interesting thing in light of everything we know about, well, there was a conversation with John and Paul where they decided to freeze George out of that stuff. Not that he was really an aspiring writer at the time, but that was going to be the partnership. That was going to be the Rodgers and Hammerstein of the Beatles. And the other thing I thought about was when Mersey Beat came along and John penned that dubious origins of the Beatles.
Yeah.
He basically gives a co-credit to George at the end. Does that ring a bell with you?
It does not ring a bell.
Yeah.
And of course, I know that story, but I haven't looked at it in quite a while.
Yeah. From John and George, What Are Friends? Something like that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I thought, that's interesting.
Uh-huh.
It's going to be impossible at this point, even though Bill Harry's still alive, to know really what did George contribute to get a credit like that, a shout out. Paul didn't get it.
Right. Huh.
To me, what it speaks to is here's George getting a taste of collaboration with John, getting that validation. And I think it was something he would chase ever after.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other things, John was a very sharp guy. And I think that he said on at least one occasion when he was explaining how the Beatles came together, that when he let Paul into the group, he knew he was going to have to keep an eye on that guy and, keep him in line.
Right.
And I don't think he had that same concern about George, which is why ultimately he did let George into the group, because he knew he could dominate that guy. And he knew he was older and he was looked up to by George. And I think that might have played a role in, I'll let him in. He's got the talent and I don't have to worry about him challenging my authority.
Right. He knows his place.
Yeah. At least he did back then.
Right. Till he didn't. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I was trying to think, and this is the temptation you have as a Beatle fan and somebody who thinks about this stuff very deeply, is to sort of come up with a psychological handle as a layperson, not trained in any of this stuff. And just in stuff that I've read through the years, and don't ask me for attribution because I can't even tell you because you absorb so much information. It's impossible. But there was a couple metaphoricals that I read, which I thought were interesting on people sort of trying to get a handle on the dynamic. First of all, as a baseline, I think it's pretty much universal agreement that the Beatles operated like a family. And that there was definitely sort of roles within a family that they sort of emulated. And that does a lot to explain the dynamic of them. Now, if you're looking at things from George's perspective, one take I read is that John was the cooler older brother to him. Now, in life, he had a couple of older brothers. I don't know if he thought of one as more cool than the other or even how that dynamic played out. We do know that as the baby of the family, that accords you certain treatment and worldview from the way you're treated by the family and your parents and the way you're going to feel as like everybody else is older and gets to enjoy cool stuff in life earlier than you do. And if you're like George, who is restless and always wanting to advance beyond the station he's in at any given time, you could see where he would chafe at that role. But on the other hand, he seems to be fairly accepting of it in the Beatles because I think he recognizes he's got a valuable gift to bring to the table. And he certainly is not aspiring to be a writer at that point. John and Paul are the ones that are doing it. They're providing the fodder that he is then allowed. He's not, at that point at least, being dictated to, okay, here's what we want on this song. And that's how you have more than we know. And it just seems like over time, decades later, we're finding out, oh, that riff that song's built on, that came from George. That was not part of the original draft, things like that. So his piece of the Beatles' pie is absolutely essential to their success. And I think he is satisfied with that at that point, at least until he starts to become a viable writer himself.
Are you referring specifically to the pre-recording days, like when they were just a live unit? Or
no, I'm thinking the EMI days, but in the pre-recording days, he's got much wider of a spotlight because the cover day. Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking of. Because, I was thinking about when they started recording and you had George Martin kind of really bossing him around, kind of constricting him.
Yeah.
So I was thinking in terms of that as like he was probably chafing in the recording studio, even in the early days at EMI, especially given John and Paul more of a sort of like license to start bossing him around a little bit more too.
Right.
To see how undervalued he is by their producer in the sense that I've read and heard that George Martin literally told him, George, these are the notes you're playing.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So
I wonder if he was accepting of that or if he was frustrated that he wasn't being allowed to express himself. it seems like he was less possessing of ego than the other two main Beatles in that there's any number of quotes, and I think you can judge by actions that his bottom line seemed to be whatever served the song, it didn't matter who came up with the idea.
Right.
And there was a quote in the context of him talking about Taxman, Paul playing the solo. It's like, yeah, he did that great bit. And as a nod to me, he made it a bit Indian. And it's like, I don't care. Whoever does whatever makes the song, the recording most successful, that's what we're going to go with. That's a refreshing attitude to have in the band. But that's what I think what sustained him for as long as it did was because he recognized that he had a value and was getting validation when they would take up his suggestions. And we know that they were manifest for at least the first half of their career before he started stepping up more as a writer himself and maybe a little bit more forceful, at least in his own material, and calling the shots on this is what I want to do.
It also depends on who's telling the account, because you use the example of Taxman. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are other accounts where he was like storming out of the studio because they handed it over. Oh, Paul, you just do it already. George has been trying for hours now. Do it. And Paul knocks it out in one take. And George is steaming about it, allegedly.
And that checks a lot of boxes in that particular source material, doesn't it? Praise Paul, diminish George.
True.
Downplay his abilities at every turn. Yeah.
And you can figure out who the author is just by that description that you just gave.
Gee.
You know?
Yeah.
I wonder who we're talking about.
Right. But conversely, it's interesting that here you have George who is willing to give up credit for stuff if it serves the song. Mm-hmm. And I was very struck by, there's any number of quotes in the Playboy interview with John where clearly the takeaway is if he's this upset about something and it's not feigned, that it must mean something to him. It must touch a nerve. And specifically, there's the whole I me mine stuff where he's taking great umbrage, feeling that he wasn't given sufficient credit in George's life and in George's book. Yep. And the thing in particular I'm thinking about is when he's talking about Norwegian Wood. And I guess it got up his nose that George is almost dismissive about his contribution with the sitar on that song.
Norwegian Wood is my song completely. And that's another thing that hurt me in George's book, where he says he didn't count the sitar on Norwegian Wood. Norwegian Wood was the first song that ever had a sitar on it, and it wasn't a casual throwaway like George implies in his book. I asked him, can you play this lick on the sitar? And he took 20 minutes or half an hour to get the lick down. And it was one of those days when the song, every time we attempted it, nobody was really in the mood, and that often happened. It used to irritate me when it was my turn to do it. And I was dissatisfied the way Norwegian Wood was going all the time. It wasn't working right. So I finally ended up just doing it by myself with the guitar. And Paul was saying, and George Martin and George Harrison, well, how do you want to do it? How do you want to do it? I said, here. And I started doing it. And I said, can you play this lick on the sitar? And he said, oh, well, give me some time. And he went over in the corner and learned the lick which I'd already written on the guitar. That lick is a guitar lick, which is played on the guitar too. Down, 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 down. That is the melody of the song. And it was written around the guitar lick. It's a D shape, and you get certain notes out of D, and I used it for that. Nowhere Man, Norwegian Wood, and there's lots of little things that D does for you, D shape. In his book, he sort of glosses over it as if it was nothing. It was the first guitar use on a pop record, and I specifically asked him to play the guitar on the record, and could he play this lick that I already was playing? Ding, 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 ding.
And I think it's in the context of, by the time he started actually taking lessons with the greatest guitar player who ever lived, he recognized how silly and embarrassing and slight his contribution to Norwegian Wood was in terms of sitar music. It's a joke. In pop, however, it's something else. Mm-hmm. It was definitely an innovation, although I would point out to John, because he was, again, sort of laying claim to, it was the first sitar used on a pop record. Well, it's coming the year that other people are attempting the same thing, and Beatles managed to pull it off first and get it to market. But the Kinks were experimenting with stuff, the Yardbirds certainly. But I guess his beef at that moment was that George didn't give him enough credit for being the guy that suggested that he play on sitar the lick that he came up with. It's like, I wrote that lick, and I was the one who said, George, you think you can play that on sitar? And half hour later, he'd figured it out, blah, 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 blah. And he didn't think that George gave him enough credit in I Me Mind for being the guy to originate what he thinks is one of the greatest innovations in pop music. And I'm not going to say he's wrong or right to feel that way, but he took it very personally. That's what I find is the most interesting thing about that.
Well, also, George was eventually confronted about that in an interview. It was about 7 years after that Playboy interview, where an interviewer spoke directly to George about it and said, John was pretty pissed off at you at the time of his death because you didn't give him credit in I Me Mine. And George's response was,
he was annoyed because I didn't say that he had written one line of the song Taxman. But the point to that was that I also didn't say how I wrote 2 lines to Come Together or 3 lines to Eleanor Rigby. I wasn't getting into any of that. I think in the balance, I would have had more things to be niggled with him about than he would have with me.
Touché.
He was ready to be asked about that.
He had 7 years to think of an answer.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that both guys in that situation kind of responded exactly the way we'd expect them to. John was a guy that was very sensitive to slights and wore it on his sleeve. And George was a guy who was a lot more chill about that stuff. No matter what he was feeling personally, I think it was more his nature to come off as magnanimous and egoless, even though clearly he's a human being that I think struggled very hard to live up to the ideals he set for himself.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I saw another interview where he was talking about how once he discovered meditation, it gave him a bigger high than any drug ever gave him. And that's why he kind of turned his back on drugs. And then like 2 seconds later, I think the interview said something along the lines of, oh, so you're completely off drugs now. He goes, well, let's not go crazy. And that pretty much,
that's funny because it's very similar to the David Wigg thing where they're talking about the stuff you give up and drugs being one. And then David Wigg's asking about celibacy. And again, don't be hasty about that. It just means illicit sex. And, even at that, clearly he struggled with that as well.
George, and what about these rules? Do you support all these things that the Krishna movement support? I mean, they don't approve, for example, of alcohol and drugs, and they recommend a certain kind of food, vegetarian sort of commitment.
Well, there's certain...
And no sex unless you're going to have children, right?
Non-illicit sex, which means... So there are members of this Radha Krishna temple who are married and who have children. So all that means is, not raving around, knocking off everybody, because that's then becomes a bit of discipline, because all those emotions like that, lust and greed, are emotions that have got to be curbed.
Oh, George totally struggled. I mean, well into the 70s and I think well into the late 70s, probably even into the 80s. There's a great book about the history of Saturday Night Live where they talked about how beyond the one episode where George appeared with Paul Simon, apparently he was coming by a lot and doing cocaine backstage with the cast of Saturday Night Live. That was what was alleged in this book about the history of Saturday Night Live.
And I don't think that was necessarily made up, because just based on stuff we know, that it was something he struggled with. And we're not here to judge any of them.
Oh, no, not at all.
No, we're definitely, because I don't want to come off as like picking favorites or that. And I know some listeners may think that. I just want to sort of parse this stuff out because I find it fascinating, because there's so much about the familial dynamic of the Beatles that I think a lot of us can relate to in our own lives. And
for sure. As a younger brother, absolutely. I feel and have felt a lot of George's pain. Having an older brother, for sure.
Is yours the John Lennon cool older brother you aspire to win the approval of?
At one time, but eventually you do grow up and you find your own way. And that was a big part of when George discovered Indian music, when he discovered Indian philosophy and religion and all that stuff. That was him finding his own path and starting to build his own persona within the group. And I think, not to get too personal, but, a lot of the interests that I have started with my brother. My brother was the Beatles fan before I was. My brother was the comic book fan before I was. And so a lot of the stuff that I ended up pursuing as a big part of my life started with my brother, but I took it in a way that I don't think he ever did. He never, as far as I know, he has not to any great extent written about the Beatles professionally.
Mm-hmm.
I know he never worked in the comic book industry, which I did for a significant part of my career. So he put me on the path, but I embraced it in a way that he never did. So I totally can relate to that, and that John was, in many ways, the guy who set George on the path that he was on, but then George took it in a different direction.
Absolutely. And I'm the third of three brothers as well. So I can totally see tons of my tastes and interests, like you, got started there. Right. And I ended up taking it further because that was the effect it had. Maybe, I don't know if that means it was more important to me, the way I received it. It was just their world. It was what they knew. But to me, it had an added allure because it came from the older sibling. Maybe I'm just thinking out loud right now, but but you can absolutely see that with George in certain respects, that John was the 50s rocker that they all aspired to be cool like, and to have a rock band as opposed to a skiffle band. And that was part of George's value in being brought into the band, was he wanted to rock, as did John, as did Paul. And so he helped enhance that. But then he goes off on this tangent that is all his own. And another thing, that for all John's talents and qualities, I don't think he ever really had an identifiable instrumental style, which is not to say he was not a superb rhythm guitarist, because he was. Right. But he wasn't the kind of guy you see in top 10 lists of like, oh, Lennon's up there as one greatest rhythm guitarist of all time. He had other talents that outstripped that, right? Yeah. But George was the one who, as the youngest guy coming into the band and learning guitar and then taking it somewhere, became known as his very singular, unique style. You could tell a George Harrison sound a mile away, even if he's playing on a Belinda Carlisle record or something. You know, that's George. You know, there's nobody else like that. So he had that other quality about him. Paul is a master of a bunch of instruments. Maybe he's got a bit of an identifiable lead guitar sound, but that's not his greatest strength. His greatest strength is compositional and singing, right?
I think John would be the first one to agree with you that he was a fair, I think his exact words were along the lines of, I'm a fair guitarist, but I don't have a style. I'm not a stylist or anything great.
Yeah, he can make it sing and howl.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I agree.
So I just wonder if that was an aspect that was a clear-cut talent of George's, that I don't know if he would have had any envy of that or not, but certainly he found him useful. He was enough of a fan of what George can do on guitar to bring him into the sessions for Imagine, where he plays on half the album.
Well, also, the cynical part of me was just, that was a way to flip the bird at Paul.
Well, okay, you're opening that door there, yes. And that's a good tangent to go off on, because in prepping for this show, I came across something. I must have heard it back in the day, because I did, in fact, listen to the Lost Lennon tapes series back when it was on. And I had forgotten that they had a piece of audio with Nicky Hopkins. And he was describing tracking How Do You Sleep? Okay. And what he had to say was,
my first inkling of what the song was about was hearing John singing it through as we're learning it. I thought, my God, you're not really going to record this. Because it was obvious who it was about. I thought, you can't be serious. These are probably just joke lyrics and you're going to modify it. No, he didn't. We were all just looking at each other. I don't even think George commented on it. And I thought, this is interesting. Here's George playing along and taking great pains on the solo to get it right. And I thought, now how is this going to affect the relationship that George has with Paul? Whatever that is or was. I mean, I knew there was a rift, obviously. Everybody knew there was the rift between John and Paul at that point. But I thought, now this is going to surely reflect a little badly on George. And I thought, is George going to refuse to play on this track? But no, he didn't. I guess he thought, well, this is John's trip, and that's up to him. It's up to these two guys to sort their feud out.
So I'd wondered that myself, if Paul took that, here's this track that John, it was something that got a ton of attention at the time, and for years afterward, he would be asked about it. So, Paul, what'd you think of this? And if it felt like a tu brute when he thought about George contributing to it. And of course, we know that Ringo was around and was like, "That's enough, John."
Mm-hmm.
He was trying to get him to dial some of it back when he was really going out there with the character assassination.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder, what was George's motivation in being on that track? Was it still trying to please the cool older brother? Was it animus toward Paul at that time? Or was it's just a funky little track and I've got a cool part in mind, I'm going to play it, and I'll leave the interpretation of this to other people?
My personal assessment is that it's probably more the first two. I think there was a lot of animus between Paul and George during that time. This was not long after he sued them, and Paul sued the other Beatles to dissolve the partnership.
Right.
If George already didn't have a lot of animosity towards Paul before that, he certainly did after it. Whether or not George wanted out, I mean, they all wanted out. That's the funny part. They all wanted out. It was like, we want a divorce. And Paul's response was, "Oh, you want a divorce? Oh, I'll give you a divorce."
Right.
And then they just didn't like the way he went about it.
And it was not long after they met face to face that he says, "You'll stay on the freaking label. Hare Krishna."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So there was a lot of that going on. I think that,
You think he was signing off on the lyrics?
I think so. And the funny thing is, I have never found any comments from Paul about George's involvement in that. I've seen plenty where he talked about the song and he talked about his relationship with John with regard to that song. I think he might have just acknowledged, yeah, and I know George played on it, but he never spoke about how he felt about it personally, as far as I know.
Right. I haven't seen anything either. And I've always wondered about, how do you ignore that? How do you compartmentalize that? Because it must feel like a double wound coming from two of your closest mates, right?
For sure. I was actually watching some of that stuff, the filmed footage of the Imagine sessions, which is obviously where all this happened. And the fact that George agreed to be filmed in the studio when we know how much he hated working on Let It Be, that he was willing to do that for John. He was willing to put up with Yoko chattering away. It was bad enough when she was there in the context of Beatles recording sessions, but now she's the queen bee because it's a John solo session. She's got even more power and influence, and George was willing to submit to that. And that's loyalty. That's loyalty to John, because we know how George felt about Yoko.
It's pretty huge. He's outside his comfort zone. He's on their turf.
Exactly. And being filmed.
Yes.
And so he was willing to put up with all that. And there was that weird conversation, if you remember.
Beatle Ed.
Thank you. You knew exactly where I was going. The whole conversation about Beatle Ed.
Is that a fresh spotted tea?
Yes.
It's fairly fresh.
This is actually a Beatle wife fixing the tea for one of the Fab Four ex-Beatles. Fab Three. See much of the Beatles these days. The other Beatles are great round.
Beatle Ed.
Beatle Ed, how is he?
He was all right, but he was just going off on a tour.
Beatle Ed's not doing so well these days, is he, Beatle Ed?
Well, he's number 5 in Sweden.
Oh, in Sweden, that's it.
Beatle Ed's not doing so well.
Right. So I guess that adds further weight to your position that he knew he was being hurtful, and that was just how he felt at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That resentment.
Yeah, I think that played a part in it. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's funny because in thinking about it, I'm thinking this song is incredibly insulting to Paul's musicality. You know, the only thing you've done was yesterday, and the sound you make is music to my ears. And it's one thing for George to quote what being, or to opine on what being in a band with Paul McCartney meant to him. He ruined me as a guitarist. He could be a bit overbearing. I'd rather play with Willie Weeks, all that sort of thing. I need to get Willie Weeks on the show. But I don't remember, even at the worst of their tensions, I'm talking the period, the McCartney album, Ram, where he criticizes Paul's musicality as a songwriter. Even if he's not crazy about the album, he'll find something to like and something to compliment. What was it? That would be something.
That would be something. Yeah, that was the one I think he really praised.
Yeah.
That would be something. And I think he said something nice about Every Night.
Yeah. And I thought that specific compliment of that would be something I thought was kind of odd. It's like, really? That's the one you're gravitating toward? Not Maybe I'm Amazed or something more obvious. Yeah. But I found that interesting, and I thought it was genuine.
I'm sure it was. I'm sure he wouldn't have picked that song to cite if he didn't really feel that way.
Yeah.
I just think it's weird that he felt that way.
Right. It's not just me then.
That passed the George Harrison smell test,
Right.
When on an album when you've got, like you said, Maybe I'm Amazed and
Every Night and Junk, there's definitely some great tunes there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there you've got, in one psychological sort of template, John is the cool older brother that younger brother aspires to win the favor of. Now, in John's perspective, he was the disciple. He was someone that tagged along almost like he was in the cult of John Lennon, and I think George rightly felt that John was overstating and not really getting him when he felt that way.
Yeah. In fact, from that same 1987 interview, in response to what you're saying right now, George said that's what he thought, meaning John. That's what John thought.
Yeah.
I liked him very much. He was a groove. He was a good lad. But at the same time, he misread me. He didn't realize who I was. And this was one of the major faults of John and Paul. They were so busy being John and Paul that they failed to realize who else was around them at the time.
Absolutely.
And this is how he felt in 1987.
Mm-hmm. So when you parse that out, he's got this grievance that, or at least in the face of them or John considering him to be nothing more than a young kid with hero worship, that he's like, no, I saw them for what they were, and they were too blind by their own
egos,
ever-sized egos to recognize what was around them. And I think that was something they would cop to if the flower pot conversation is anything to go by. In 1969, where they're trying to address the George problem, and they recognize that their egos have kept him suppressed.
Right.
Only by that time, 1969, where he's coming on strong as a writer and looking to find a platform within the Beatles to express himself, and they're kind of shutting him out. Maybe it was justifiable in 63, 64, 65. But by this time, undeniably, he is a world-class songwriter on a peer level with them. And they're still seeing him the way an older brother would look down at the younger brother. I think he even commented this as, it was that comment where he's quoting Gandhi about cast the image that you see for yourself, you know what I'm talking about, and don't be defined by others' image of you. Yeah. And that was the context where he was saying, basically, look, they're seeing me the way they did back in the Quarrymen days, and that's a problem.
Yeah, you can give them credit for having enough self-awareness to realize what they were doing to him, but you have to damn them for not doing anything about it.
Right. And it's funny that John in that very conversation expresses that he's of two minds about wanting to make things right with George or let him go.
Yeah. And to his credit, he knew he was being recorded. What was it? 9 months later, the infamous 443 scheme that he proposed. If he was being genuine and he did push for something to be an A side and what was the Inner Light as a B side and all that, and get George more space on the singles, to his credit, John did put his money where his mouth was and did try to make things better for George in that way.
I think you put your finger on something significant there, because I think in the Beatle lore, and we've talked about it on the show before, there's certainly a perception out there that John, once he met Yoko, certainly sort of checked out when it came to working on George's material. And that even came up in that very conversation, the 444-2, that George says something like, I think for a lot of my songs, you weren't even there. Right. And John pushes back on that. He goes, no, it's because you were doing something Indian. You didn't need me and blah, 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 blah. And I think that's been overstated a bit for sure. We know he wasn't there on Here Comes the Sun because he had the car accident, but he's there on something. He was there on Old Brown Shoe, but George wiped his part. George gives him the lead solo to play on For You Blue. I Mean Mine, undeniably, he wasn't on because, number one, he'd given his divorce notice, and number two, he was in Denmark. Even if he was willing to finish up the Let It Be soundtrack, he wasn't in the country. But that was a song he dismissed upon first hearing anyway, so who knows? But it definitely has been a bit overstated, and John gets defensive about it. And he's like, we grooved, going back to Don't Bother Me. I can remember, blah, blah, blah. So it obviously meant something to him to not be taken by George as somebody not interested in his stuff. But at the same time, you've got everything going on during the Get Back sessions, and maybe it's different John there. It's heroin John, that he couldn't be bothered to learn Let It Down or to take seriously All Things Must Pass or the other songs that he was bringing in at that time. So I think mostly George's grievance with John at that time was less getting more access to Beatle real estate on a record than it was his use of Yoko as his mouthpiece.
Oh, yeah. That supposedly is why he stormed out when he quit the band on January 10th. And then they had that emergency meeting at, I guess, Ringo's house, and he stormed out because Yoko was doing all the talking for John. And that was fingernails on the chalkboard for him.
Right. Absolutely.
And damn Peter Jackson for not including this in Get Back. When the next day, when Paul, Ringo, Linda, and Neil Aspinall were talking in Twickenham, and they were saying that George pointed a finger right at John, and John was feigning that he didn't know what George was talking about.
Right.
And George was like, you know damn well what I'm talking about. He goes, why don't you, speak up? Because I don't know what you're talking. You know what I'm talking. And that was what really set him off and why he left.
That's huge. And it gets really downplayed and Get Back, where you've got 10 minutes of Paul arguing against something that you don't get to hear what the argument is, because that whole conversation is like 40 minutes long.
That was so baffling to me. I was yelling at the screen. My wife and my daughter were like, why are you so upset? I'm like, because I know what's missing.
Right. Right. Yeah. And you've got millions of Beatle fans around the world who watch Get Back like, what was wrong with Yoko? She was fine. She's just sitting there knitting.
Exactly. Now, you know what? Since we're on that particular topic, what do we know at this point about the alleged fist fight that happened between John and George? You would think that Get Back had dispelled that story. But when you go back and you read all of the accounts, and George Martin comes out and says, even though he wasn't there, he only heard about it secondhand.
Right.
But people were talking about it. I don't know if I'm willing to let that go.
I thought upon seeing the footage when they reconvene at Apple Studio day one that they're filming again, because I guess the very first day one, they didn't film.
They didn't film, right.
Right. So it's really the second day with George back in the fold. And it's in that Michael Housekow interview or article in the paper that it's like the elephant in the room that they very much want to shed light on. I thought it felt ostentatious. That they were over the top playing for the cameras about what a lie this was. And that's not to say I advocate, oh yeah, there definitely was a fist fight. There had to be, that it got physical. I'm just saying is that at this distance, what do we know? Well, we know that George Martin said that did happen and that was covered up. That's an actual George Martin quote. He could be wrong because he wasn't there, but he believed it to be true enough to actually say it out loud to people. And it definitely seemed to be reported at the time, physical or not, that the grievance leading to George walking out was between John and George. In a way, we get spun later on as well. Paul's telling me how to play guitar and I don't need this. So that became the revisionism that occurred not too long after. It's during their lawsuit. They're defending themselves against Paul, where they're talking about differences in musical taste and Paul coming on too strong, blah, blah, blah. So they'd settled on that narrative.
Right. Regardless, I mean, whatever it was, John and George put it aside quickly enough because within a year or two, when the divorce happens and he goes with John.
He had been invited to Toronto in September, and he didn't. He said, I don't want any part of this avant-garde stuff. And, but then he shows up for the Lyceum show in December, which 40 minutes of Don't Worry Kyoko. And then he's among the first on speed dial when John comes back from Denmark and tracks Instant Karma.
Right.
And George is very instrumental in the shape of that record. He's the one that brought Inspector, right? And definitely helped produce the thing, played guitar on it, which got wiped out, but played one of the pianos on it. So he helps John achieve a hit record outside of the Beatles. Looking
at the solo years, the fact that they were on a radio show together in 74.
Right. And that's at a very volatile time when you had the history of John and George at that particular time is really interesting. I'm sure you've seen the note that John penned with the drawings on it that he sent to George. Hey, George, shouldn't we? Isn't it time? It's like a conciliatory note. It's dated 74, but not a date on it, but it says 10 years to 84.
Right.
So it's basically striking this uncharacteristically conciliatory tone from John Lennon, reaching out to George. And my own conclusion that tone comes from the fact that he is in his May Pang period,
right,
where he is mending fences with people, starting with his own son. Right. So you've got that. We know that on opening night of the Dark Horse tour, which was in Vancouver, that they sent flowers. They then went to see the Nassau show. And that was when the thing that happened backstage happened. Take off those glasses, Lennon, and then it gets sort of physical, where apparently he whips him off John because he's not taking him off fast enough. And that leads to John's telling of it. So we know this is not BS. It actually happened. It was in Melody Maker. I think Chris Charlesworth was the interviewer. It gets published in early 75, where he's talking about that. And he describes, I let him do it because I know what pain feels like. And then he agrees to join him for the Madison Square Garden show, which then, because the stars weren't right when it came time to go to the plaza and sign the breakup document. He doesn't show up, and pisses off George again. But then within 24 hours of that, he's at Club Hippopotamus for the wrap party for the Dark Horse tour. And then they do that interview together.
Right, where they sound very mellow.
Yes, to put it one way. Yeah. But what's striking about that is that one of the things that comes up is the Lennon Remembers interview, where George is backing up John.
Right.
And then all the criticism he got for the nonsense he spewed.
I remember the day when John did an interview with a certain magazine and said certain things, and then I remember the day when he disagreed with what he'd said, but the man who interviewed him denied him the right to change his mind, and even though it was 2.5 years later, still went ahead and published something which John said he no longer agreed with himself on, which means the dream was over, yet certain people wouldn't allow him to have his dream over. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. In other words, imagine if somebody, or you accidentally bang your head and you shout, ow. That's the end of it. Right, I mean, it doesn't go on for the next 5 years, right? And we all do that.
Yeah, he's defending John. He's explaining that John changed his mind and didn't want that book out, and basically calling out Winter without calling him by name.
Yeah.
That he's a dick.
They're presenting a united front after much feuding, much estrangement at that time. So it's, again, like a family. You can't criticize my brother.
Right. And they even get into a disagreement on the air about David Bowie and Elton John, that John likes them and George doesn't see what's so special about. It was just a very interesting appearance. And George also reminisces during that interview. He talks about the bit of songwriting advice that John gave him years earlier, which he also mentions in Get Back, where John just says, power through. If you have an idea for a song, don't put it aside and try to finish it later. Try to get the whole thing done in one session. And you could see that that's advice that George really took to heart, because it's something that he remembers, and he's now brought it up 5 years after the last time we saw him bring it up, which was in the Get Back footage.
Yeah.
So, it's funny because post Beatles, there's that joint interview on the radio, and he appeared on a TV show with Ringo. An interview show with Ringo. This was after John died. So never with Paul.
No.
Never with Paul. And it's just really interesting. There's that really interesting I think it's 1967. Yeah, it would have been late 1967, where it's just George and John on the David Frost show.
Yeah, talking up TM.
And talk about TM, And
John is so fired up about it at that time.
Yeah. And John claims to share George's belief in reincarnation. And, George does this whole thing about what he believes about reincarnation, and you keep coming back. It's basically the lyrics from The Art of Dying.
Right.
You keep coming back and each time you rise towards to be a perfect being. And John says, oh, yeah, I agree with all that, which was really interesting.
That must have been getting that kind of validation from the cool older brother, what that must have meant to George at the time. And once you get a taste of it and it gets snatched away, it makes it that much harder.
For sure.
Now, 1971, to go back to that, the Imagine sessions, he's on half the album. He's backing John on this assault on Paul, on How Do You Sleep. And then not that long after that comes the Bangladesh event that John says yes, and then he says no, because George will not have a sharing of the stage with Yoko doing her thing, as he wouldn't in Toronto. And now it's his gig, and and that's his right.
Right.
But at that point, I always kind of wondered, because they sort of laid the blame for John pulling out to his not wanting to share the stage, George not wanting to share the stage with Yoko. That was why he said, well, screw it, then you don't get me. I wonder if there was something more to it than that. If maybe his own ego playing basically in George's backing band might have been how he saw it. And he didn't want to do it, because he does it again 3 years later when he pulls out, or George kind of tells him, don't bother. But then he goes on to say, well, I wasn't really keen on doing the Madison Square thing anyway, because I only felt I should offer it because I'd just done it with Elton.
I'd heard this might have been in the Peter Doggett book, You Never Give Me Your Money. I know for a fact, I read it somewhere, that it wasn't so much that John was standing by Yoko. It was more like he just didn't want to have Yoko haranguing him. John was more than willing to do that Bangladesh show without Yoko, but he knew that Yoko would never let him hear the end of it. And he
was henpecked.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really the reason. It's not like, hey, if you don't get her, you don't get me. And it was more like, I don't want to, dude. Happy wife, happy life, man.
Yeah, I got to live with this woman. Yeah,
exactly. So that's one of the accounts that I'd heard.
Clearly, whatever it was, it blew up suddenly, because he immediately takes off to Paris, leaves his clothes behind and all that. And
right.
It was, and I could
so
see
that
that
an
being,
excuse.
Yeah, right. You storm out because you don't want to go down there and subject yourself to that. So, but when I was going back looking at some of the public, or at least two journalist pronouncements from John about George that very year, and if I'm correct in the timing, it was definitely in 71 that they're talking to McCabe, the guy who co-wrote Apple to the Core.
Mm-hmm.
So he's doing all these interviews. And here's how the exchange goes. McCabe, let's talk a bit about George. He's perhaps the most enigmatic Beatle. Are you saying George is more conventional than he makes himself out to be? John, there's no telling George. He always has a point of view about that wide, you know. John places his hands a few inches apart. You can't tell him anything. Yoko, George is sophisticated fashion-wise, so damning him with faint praise there. John, he's very trendy, and he has the right clothes and all that. Yoko, but he's not sophisticated intellectually. John, no. He's very narrow-minded and doesn't really have a broader view. Paul is far more aware than George. One time in the Apple office in Wigmore Street, I said something to George, and he said, I'm as intelligent as you know.
Right.
This must have been resentment, but he could have left any time if I was giving him a hard time. McCabe, what did you say? John, I didn't answer. Of course he's got an inferiority complex working with Paul and me. Yoko, in the case of Paul, it's not that he's not sophisticated. I'm sure that he's intellectually sophisticated as well. It's just that he's aware, and yet he doesn't want to know. John, whereas George doesn't really know what's happening, you know?
Yeah, I've read that interview many times.
I just wonder, had George heard those words at the time, what he would have thought.
Yeah.
And maybe he did. Maybe that was part of his simmering resentment that exploded in 74. But then, of course, as you point out, in 73, in between, we've got the I'm the Greatest session, where apparently things are going so well that he then is like, hey, John, we should get a band going.
Right.
And John immediately shoots him down.
Right, because he'd be in a band with John Lennon any day, but not Paul.
Right. And that day he thought would be in 73, but it wasn't.
I think there is another interview. Maybe it was that one that you were just quoting from. Maybe it might have been the Jan Wenner interview from 70, but there was a point where Yoko goes on and on about George. I think John stops her and says, all right, listen, enough about George. Stop picking on him, kind of thing.
Oh, that does ring a bell. Yeah. Maybe that was Lennon remember.
But the other thing is, and again, this could carry over to the resentment having to do with the I Me Mine book, is in 1980, there are a couple of real pointed barbs that John either knowingly or unknowingly aimed at George. One was a Bangladesh was caca.
Yes,
I mean,
in Playboy.
This was the guy put so much on the line for this great cause, and he's dismissing it as caca. Although at that point, I have to say, George might have agreed with him.
Right. I don't think he's necessarily criticizing the cause as much as he is the whole trappings of trying to do a charitable benefit and it becoming this big headache and mess.
Right.
And it's like he's what I took from that was he doesn't believe in them because they're more trouble than they're worth, and they're only done to make these people look good in public. They don't really do what they're meant to do.
Right. Yeah.
It's a fraud.
Yeah, but I could see George sort of like, well, wait a minute. It wasn't caca. It was,
Yeah.
But I think more importantly was that John said, again, I think in the 1980 Playboy interview, he said that he felt that he and Paul could have been the Beatles without George and Ringo, but there's no way that George and Ringo could have been the Beatles without him and John.
Yes.
Without Paul and John. And that, I think, even took the interviewer aback.
Sure.
You mean if Paul McCartney and John Lennon got together, would they produce some good songs? Maybe, maybe not. But whether George and Ringo joined in or not is irrelevant, because Paul and I created the music. Okay?
First of all, it's counter to his sentiments to that point. But I think it really underscores, because he doesn't just say that in Playboy. He says that in the Newsweek interview. He said it more than once during that period. And it's like anytime the past comes out, he's very dismissive of, I don't follow the Stones. I don't follow Dylan,
which
any
we know
of
is
this stuff.
Paul.
Yeah. And then the next page, it's like he knows very much about Dylan's Christian period. And, if that's the trip he needs to be on, then let him be on it, blah, blah, blah.
He praised Emotional Rescue. He thought it was a beautiful.
Yes. And then the Fred Seaman to-do list surfaced where he's ordering him to go out and buy Back to the Egg and McCartney too, So, obviously he's very disingenuous about the stuff he's saying and go jack off to Rolling Wings when he's doing it himself,
Right.
Yeah. But it really speaks to, as he amps it up in the Playboy interview talking about I Me Ein and his resentment against George. I wonder what is informing that, because two things come to mind. If you look at him, the last vestige of him being wholeheartedly conciliatory toward George comes at the end of the Dark Horse tour, then into 75 when he does that Charlesworth tour and he's talking about the incident with George and how he recognized George was in pain and he let it go. So there he is being very sweet, and that's the tail end of the quote-unquote lost weekend. And then he goes into this 5-year period that we get the narrative of what he says it was about and what he was doing and all that stuff. But then we get the interview from George where he talks about apparently having been at the Dakota with John during that period. You know what I'm talking about? I wish I had audio to this. I've just got the print.
This would have been like a couple of years before John died, right?
That's what he's describing, apparently, yeah. So this was published in 87, so it's during the round of interviews for Cloud9. He's talking to Anthony DeCurtis. What was your relationship with John during that period when he was living in New York and not recording or playing? Were you in touch with him? George: I saw him a couple of times. I didn't often go to New York, but when I was in New York, I'd go see him, and he was nice. He was always enthusiastic. That period where he was cooking bread and stuff. I always got an overpowering feeling from him. Almost a feeling that he wanted to say much more than he could, or than he did. You can see it in his eyes. But it was difficult. DeCurtis: in what way? George: well, you'd read all these stories, and they'd keep coming all the time, about how the Beatles weren't actually anything, that they didn't mean anything, that he was the only one who had a clue about anything, and the wife. There was a definite strained relationship right from the White Album. There was a lot of alienation between us and him. Well, there was alienation amongst all of us. It was particularly strained because having been in a band since being kids, then suddenly we're all grown up and we've all got these other wives. That didn't exactly help. All the wives at that time really drove wedges between us. And then after the years when I saw John in New York, it was almost like he was crying out to tell me certain things or to renew things, relationships, but he wasn't able to because of the situation he was in.
Yeah.
It's like, wow. And the funny thing is, you've read Pete Shotton's memoir, right?
Bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Bits and pieces.
He says something very similar about having dinner with John. I felt he was trying to tell me something.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
I did.
It's like, what is it, Stockholm Syndrome? It's like blinking SOS with his eyes. What was going on there? Yeah. So I wonder, we talked of Peter Doggett. He wrote and delivered a manuscript examining those years, Prisoner of Love. What the hell was in that book that got it spiked?
Yeah, that book is a prisoner of
right, of something not quite resembling love.
Yeah, I'd love to know. Yeah, exactly. And Linda kind of alludes to it a little bit also in the 1984 Playboy interview, the joint interview that she and Paul did, where she basically says that John was really in a bad way during those years and that he and Paul could have really helped each other, but they were playing all these games. And that if they could just let the walls down and really connect again, but he just couldn't. Paul, we know, is willing. I mean, Paul invited him to go to New Orleans.
Yeah.
And that was right around the time that he got back with Yoko.
Right. And then January 1980, that dynamite weed he had that he was offering and got blocked there. Ends up taking it to Japan.
Yeah, exactly.
So it makes me wonder if he's meeting with George during that period and wanting to say something, yet his public pronouncements are pretty derisive toward George, certainly in 1980. But then I look back at the questionnaire in 1976. Somebody sends him these list of topics and looking for one-word answers. You know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't. I know, but I'm very intrigued.
Yeah, okay. So it's all the usual suspects. And for George, his response is lost.
Wow.
This is 76. So how do we interpret that? Lost in that George is not the disciple anymore and is looking critically at John? Is it lost in his Krishna, lost in his nonstop partying? And, you know, that was really true of 76 or 74 than it was of 76. 76, he was in a much better place, but I don't know if the word got to John. So I've often wondered about that, what exactly he meant by that.
Well, his marriage was busted up at that point.
Well, he was with Olivia by 76, though.
Was John aware? I mean, I guess John must have been aware, right?
Well, he must have met her because she was part of the Dark Horse entourage.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So he was divorced, but he was with Olivia by that point.
That was the year of 33 1/3. So he's 2 singles off that, Crackerbox Palace and this song.
Yeah.
He's on SNL. He's singing with Paul Simon. So it's like, what the hell is informing that assessment?
That assessment. Yeah. Yeah.
Had they not recovered? Had they fallen back into disfavor with each other after the end of 74 when they did that interview together? I don't know. But I mean, he certainly doesn't seem to be impressed with George's successes to that point. Maybe Dark Horse wasn't.
He wasn't even impressed with All Things Must Pass.
No, yes. That he was. And again, if you're that critical, that ostentatiously negative about something, what does it say about you?
Right. Yeah. Especially since at the time, and even to this day, there are people who say All Things Must Pass is the best solo Beatles album, bar none. And I like Plastic Ono Band a lot. Sure. And there are a couple of tracks that I don't love. And I like Imagine a lot. A couple of tracks I don't love. Be sure you've put out the perfect album before you're so quick to criticize what George did, you know? On the other hand, George could be a pain in the ass. He could be a pain in the ass. And I could see John being sort of fed up with all the complaining. George liked to put forth the narrative that, I only had a quota of 1 or 2 tunes per album. Well, look, Revolver, you had 3, you know? And you and I talked about this, I think the last time I was on, was that the reason why George didn't have more than 1 song on Sgt. Pepper is because he wasn't pitching any.
Right. Really. He withdrew.
So there's that. I find it hilarious. I have this new book out that's on the stands right now called The Beatles, The Making of the White Album. And I found a quote from George in 1969 where he was criticizing the White Album. I think it was too much. I think it's a real slog for people to get through to try to listen in one sitting, to listen to a double album of all those songs. And this is the guy who the following year put out a triple disc album.
Right. He's not entirely consistent with his perspectives on things, but none of them were.
Right.
But when you look at when John was calling out everything down to the packaging of All Things Must Pass, it looks like an asthmatic Leon Russell on the cover. And Lennon remembers his Plastic Ono Band hadn't really come out. I think it was December 8th, 1970s when they taped the interview. And I think that's more or less the release date for Plastic Ono Band. So he had no idea how it was going to perform in the marketplace. What he did know is that, as he said, My Sweet Lord is on every radio station. Every time he turns it on, I think there must be a God because that's all I'm hearing on the radio. And he said, I don't want to hurt George, but it's not the kind of music I would buy.
I listen.
You know,
Right.
Yeah, fair enough. No one's expecting you to. But clearly, it was even that early on. I think it had only been out, 10 days or something like that. It's turned into a monster. And if Sgt. Pepper took Paul by surprise, I think All Things Must Pass took John by surprise.
Yeah.
In terms of what it was doing in the world. And he didn't see that coming. Yeah.
It probably bothered him. Like he was willing to make light of it when Ringo got a number one.
Yes.
You know, it's just the student has become the master.
Right.
And the master doesn't like it. Not all the time, you know?
It bothered him enough that, as he would very frankly describe for Imagine, it's like he recognized that he needed to put sugar on it to make it commercial.
Right.
And he didn't like the fact that Plastic Ono Band didn't become the monster on the same level as All Things Must Pass. Therefore, he did what he did production-wise with Imagine. Yeah, which he considered to be roughly the same album, just more produced.
Right. For conservatives like you and me. And Paul. Yeah. We talked a lot, and I think a lot of it boils down to younger brother syndrome and older brother syndrome and the unwillingness to see the person that you've always looked at as a boy, as someone inferior to you, and the thing is, it can be argued whether or not George ever reached the same level in terms of, not in terms of accomplishment, because surely he did.
Sure.
But in terms of like the quality of the material, did he become as good a songwriter as John and or Paul? That's debatable.
It's entirely subjective. In common consensus, probably not. And yet, you look at the quantifying things that are out there, and Here Comes the Sun is like the most downloaded Beatles song of all time.
Right.
So, again, the validation is there if you're looking for it, depending on what yardstick.
Right.
The other metaphor describing this family dynamic that I saw out there somewhere, which I thought might even more resonate more than the cool older brother, was John, the absentee father, and Paul, the mother, the nurturer, the one that's going to make you eat those vegetables, that's going to take care of you, shove all the things down your throat that you don't want, that are for your own good. You never doubt the love is there, but you still strive, when daddy's not around and always got a new lady in his life. That's George looking at John and Yoko. It's like, you want to get his approval. You want him to give you that pat on the head. And meanwhile, you are going to resent mother for making you do your homework and all that stuff. That seems to be a fairly, at least broadly accurate template of the dynamics between them. If you have to look at another reason why he was so publicly negative toward Paul for a lot of years, because mother's always going to be there. You're not going to lose mother. Whereas John, very rarely did he criticize him, and usually it was in response to something, John misreading me or something like that.
That's a really good point. And, again, before I knew the bigger picture and all I knew was what the Beatles said in interviews. I mean, I bought into John's narrative that, George came to me to help him write a few lines on Taxman because he couldn't go to Paul at that point because Paul wouldn't help him.
Yeah.
But you look at those, again, I did the research for the White Album book that I did and looked at who the personnel was on each track. And Paul is busting his ass on the George tracks, and he's contributing a lot to the George tracks. And there are a few George tracks on that album that John doesn't play on. He doesn't play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. He doesn't play on Long, Long, Long. Paul does.
Right. Savoy Truffle.
Yeah. And again, I leave the Abbey Road stuff to the side because, for one thing, he was recovering from a car accident, John's. But even there, Paul delivered one of the best bass performances of his Beatles career on what song? Something.
Sure.
So the idea that Paul had reached a point where he just wasn't going to help George. Look, maybe Paul wasn't going to sit down and write with George at a certain point and think up lyrics and put any thought. Maybe that was the case. Maybe John was accurate about that. But
I wonder that because conversely, Eleanor Rigby, George is helping him with the lyrics. And at that same time.
I can think of a million times when I wrote a few lines or verses to Eleanor Rigby or something else too. They didn't really help me that much.
So, and not only is George helping him, but Pete Shotton's helping him, Ringo's helping him, Mal Evans, whoever's in the room, inspiring another round of resentment from John. So
from John, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot to what you say about Paul's always going to be there. You can take Paul for granted for both good and ill. And it certainly resonated in the way he treated Paul, at least publicly.
Yeah.
But with John, John, again, you made such a great analogy as, John's the absentee father who ran off with your evil stepmother. And that makes you want him even more because he's out of reach.
Yes, exactly.
It makes him the object of your desire, makes you want his approval even more.
Boom. Exactly. Yeah. People wondering why John was the one who tended to his face, disrespect him, while Paul would work his ass off on his songs, yet Paul was one he criticized constantly. Maybe that dynamic comes into play with explaining why George was the way he was in his criticisms and seeking of praise.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah. Something I found, again, just kind of looking for stuff that was relevant to this conversation. There was in the London Sun, during the White Album sessions, August 7, 1968, there was a writer named Alan Hall who apparently was given access to Studio 2 while they're working on, of all things, Not Guilty. And he's describing George trying to get the vocal down because they finished the backing track, all 102 takes of it at this point.
Right.
And John is sitting there basically encouraging him. And I thought, what a cool insight. For all the criticism we give of John of checking out when it's George's turn to record a song, here he is, doesn't need to be there, and is helping him get a song that they ultimately ended up scrapping at the time anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I'll read a little bit of it here. This is from the account published in the London Sun. John is sitting at a formidable console, manipulating a button which enables him to speak to George Harrison in a box on the studio floor, having sung for the 27 millionth time a song of his own called Not Guilty. The Beatles did the instrumental backing in the previous 2 days. The tape of it is being played over and over again, and George is singing his words on top of it. 4 times I've heard him sing the song. It's getting better all the time, says George Martin. Martin appears to be paying little attention, even reading the paper, but evidently is missing nothing. He is deliberately detached. He appears to leave everything to them, but his role psychologically is essential, I would think. George, in the box on the studio floor, has finished the song once again and shows no signs of impatience. It is taken for granted that he's going to have to sing it 100 times more, and he still sounds appallingly keen. He is, however, getting slightly lost in the repetition. Just a minute, did I sing the same verse twice there? He did. Up at the console, John is encouraging. It's great, he says, as Liverpool is George, like singing through a deaf aid. But he really means it. It's coming, he says, it's coming. So I found that a fascinating write-up to something that, I don't know if we have any audio tape of that, but wow. There's John encouraging George when he's struggling to get through Not Guilty. Kind of counter to what you would expect.
Now, again, this is me putting on my cynical hat. You think that could have been because there was a guy in the
journalist
studio
there, he's putting on a show. Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of journalism, I find it interesting that when it comes to media, Paul's the one that knows how to deal with it. He's quite comfortable. You never really see him too often expressing resentment at journalists. And John knows how to manipulate it.
Right.
Contrary to him calling Paul the greatest PR man in the world, I think John, especially John and Yoko, showed themselves to be more than the equal of anybody.
Absolutely.
George is the one that seemingly openly bristles at reporters, past a certain point in the Beatles, and then from that point on. You catch him in a good mood with the press, it's very rare. And maybe such as promoting Cloud 9 when he absolutely is on a mission that he needs to generate some goodwill. Other than that, he couldn't care less. So I think that some of the perception of him as being negative or a whiner, things like that, it's like he doesn't help himself. If he's handing journalists and the media a negative impression, who does he have to blame for that?
There's a great story. I think I might have talked to you about it at one point. That this guy, Larry Ratso Sloman, when he was writing for Rolling Stone, and was covering the Dark Horse tour for Rolling Stone. And George didn't really want to interview him, and he was very wary of it because Rolling Stone had really been kind of cruel to him. And the reporter, Sloman, managed to win George over, and they had a great interview, just a great interview. And if I remember correctly, because I heard about this a couple of years ago, the article in Rolling Stone comes out and it rips the tour apart, and it just really makes George look bad.
I'm guessing that's the Ben Fong Torres one, Lumbering in the Material World.
No. This was written by Larry Ratso Sloman. Okay. It was an interview with George.
Because that was the one that I know that really ticked him off. But when you read the article, it's the one where he's criticizing the fans and for getting high during the tour or during the concerts and all. He's really pissy, George is.
Well, the punchline to this story is that when the story saw print, and Sloman was like horrified, and he went home and he found the original carbon copies of the original art version of his article, and he sent it to George. And it took a few months for George to get back to him, but he got back to him and he says, "Okay, I read your piece." He goes, "So you're not the asshole, here." He knew it was Wenner.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
So he has a reason to be pissed off at the press. He certainly has a reason. This guy's article was completely rewritten to make him look as bad as possible.
And as we know from the recent Wenner books that came out about Rolling Stone, that was standard operating procedure for political reasons. Yeah. Like when the first draft of the McCartney album, 1970 review comes out, and it's too positive. And so they swap it out for another one. With Wenner telling the writer, this is a political statement, talking about the McCartney album. So therefore, you have to frame it through this prism rather than praise it for its musicality. So, yeah, that's absolutely a thing.
And amusingly enough, one of the other things that I found was an interview with Philip Norman, circa 1987, where Philip Norman, of all people, said that George at the time was the only one who can tell the stories now about the Beatles. He's the only one we can turn to hear the truth about the Beatles, because Paul won't do it and Ringo can't do it. And he was pressed, "What do you mean by that?" He goes, "Well, McCartney rewrites history and Ringo doesn't know anything."
Ooh.
And that with John gone, George is the only source that we have now to get the story of the Beatles. Knowing how little Norman thinks of George, I thought that was really, really interesting. And Norman actually, in the same interview, said that John would routinely refer to George as that kid, and that he was very patronizing towards him.
In the Beatles days, or this after this?
In the Beatles days, that during the Beatles days, John would always refer to George as that kid, and he was very patronizing towards him, and that stuck for an awful long time. And it's at the root of the resentment and the discomfort and the rancor that George had as a Beatle, that it all stems from that. That was according to Philip Norman.
When did Norman say this?
1987.
Okay, so it's after Shout.
Oh, yeah. Well, about 5 or 6 years after Shout.
Yeah, but before he writes the Lennon book and then the Paul book, and now he's writing the George book.
Before.
Yeah,
well before. Yeah.
So
hearing Philip Norman as George's proponent, especially seeing some of the other stuff that I've seen Philip Norman write about George.
Oh, you mean like his memorial article after George's death? Jeez. It only rivals Dave Dexter's piece in Billboard when John was killed. Did you ever read that?
I'm sure I did, but refresh my memory.
It was like something to the effect of, too bad he was killed, but he was a pain in the ass to work with.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Wasn't it the way Norman called George was, as soon as all the material that he'd written while he was in Lennon and McCartney's orbit was used up, he had nothing else in the tank? Yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Great tribute.
Which makes it interesting that when he said on this very show, he would never write a book about George or Ringo. And it's like, okay, so we're at the bottom of the barrel, I take it.
I guess so.
I think it's legacy time, because he totally reversed himself on his disdain for Paul when he did that book a few years ago.
Well, for me, that was a real correcting of the narrative, because as an 11-year-old, 12-year-old boy reading Shout for the first time, that book struck me as utter bullshit. I mean, not knowing anything about the Beatles except the most superficial knowledge that I had when I was 11 or 12. We're talking 1981. I knew that Shout was just full of it.
Having read Growing Up with the Beatles and Paperback Writers at that point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I saw the McCartney book as much more of a much needed corrective and the much needed mea culpa on his part.
Thank you. Yeah, so, I saw it as a total political move. And I just wonder if it just means he's just trying to get on the right side of history so that the day they dump the dirt on his coffin, it's not going to be that guy that said Lennon was 75% of the Beatles.
Right.
Yeah,
that may have a lot to do with it. Whatever the reason, I'm at least glad that it's being done. That's the thing for me.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to read at least. I'm going to at least see what he has to say, see if there's anything revelatory or if it just seems like he's feeling the metaphorical gun to his head. I better say something nice about George while I can.
Right. But it does make you understand why George was so wary of reporters and the press and all that kind of stuff, because he had the receipts, you know?
Yeah. And he wasn't afraid to share them. Isn't there the line in This Guitar Keeps From Crying about missed the point just like before, the thing about climbing the Rolling Stone wall? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to read that as anything other than a punchback at Rolling Stone for the terrible Dark Horse coverage.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think we kind of figured out it's a family thing. Full stop.
Yeah, and it's funny, just to pick up on something that you made the comparison to the absentee father who ran off with his stepmother. When John died, George described it as it's like losing your parents.
Yeah.
That was his exact words, like losing your parents.
Isn't that interesting? That's the dynamic he still had at that point. Certainly, it describes the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
This is big.
And the scary part is that he talked about such a thing like that possibly happening to him, but he kept on stressing he wasn't important enough. He could not imagine that anybody would see him as important enough to want to do that to. And damn it, the same thing happened, you know?
Right. Horribly.
Just unbelievable.
Yeah. I actually read the book. There was a slim volume out on the attack at Friar Park. Mm-hmm. And the only reason I haven't had the guy on the show to talk about it is it's just such a downer. You know, there's no way to get through a conversation about it without feeling bad. But definitely, I remember seeing, quote, I think it was from Keith Richards, who, of course, knew George quite well,
right.
that he felt that the knife really was what ultimately killed him because it took the will to live out of him when cancer came back. And when you read this book, it's like there's no mistaking it. It was more horrific than the public knew at the time.
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah. I think Danny pretty much alluded to that as well, that the attack took the fight out of him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was a guy that if you look at it from his perspective of what he'd spent the bulk of his adult life pursuing, which is basically setting yourself up for the optimum leaving of the material world.
Mm-hmm.
I could see that he'd had enough. I don't want to make it sound like he had a death wish, but definitely more than most people, he was ready to transition on.
Mm-hmm. At that point, for sure.
Yeah, and know that he could do it in peace.
Yeah. And there is something really heartwarming to me that he and Paul managed to mend a lot of the fences, before the end. And that Paul got the chance to do that, which, depending on who you speak to or who you read comments from, he never felt like he ever really got the chance to fully get back with John the way he would have liked to. And I think that he at least was able to do that with George.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there was Mother being there for him.
Yep.
Taking care of him to the end.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It should be said. I do think that this is a valid observation, is that for all his gratuitous bad-mouthing of Paul musically, it seems that their friendship, and I think we talked about this on the previous show we did about Paul and George, that I think their personal interaction friendship was intact and was a lot more enduring than most of the public knew. Because like anytime George would address it, it was to the press who we already didn't have a super comfortable relationship with. And it would be something like, I think Paul needs to get some publicity for his tour. So he's saying this about co-writing with me or whatever. But it seemed like socially they stayed close. And certainly if the interactions of their kids or anything they judge by, they're absolutely as close as a family could be.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
And it's funny how we are so invested as fans that it makes our heart feel glad to see that stuff.
Yeah, it does. I should probably focus more attention on my own family.
Screw them.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis.
Hare Krishna. Hi, George. It's John. John? Winston O. Boogie, Manhattan, New York. Okay, hail, rock and roll. Oh, Johnny, how are you? Oh, I'm okay, Just a quick word about I Me Mine, George, please. Your Auntie Mimi? No, I Me Mine. About I Me Mine. You mean the song? No, the book. You know full well what I'm talking about, George. Stop pissing around, Okay, somebody's got out the wrong side of the bed this morning, haven't they? Listen, anyway, I'd be quite prepared for that eventuality. George, please, what's your excuse, For what? For not including me in the book, yap, I'm sorry if I said something amiss. Just keep talking, George, okay? Look, you won't interfere with the basic rugged concept of me personality, will you? And will you stop reciting lines from A Hard Day's Night, George, please, All right, You're very clean, though, aren't you? Look, I just can't believe, I didn't get a mention, George. You mentioned Paul, Ringo. Christ, you even mentioned your granddad, Yeah, but, I've seen your granddad, he lives in your house. Oh, just forget it, George. Yoko was right about you, She's a drag, a well-known drag. We turn the sound down on her when she's on TV and say rude words. Hello? No, he's gone.